come in, get comfortable, and let the day set itself down. Tonight we are going to travel together, you and I, all the way back to a green thread of a river running through a vast desert, more than 5,000 years ago, and we are going to stay there, unhurried, for a very long while. This is the entire story of ancient Egypt, told from its first farmers to its last queen. And it is told for sleep. Nothing here will startle you. Kingdoms will rise and fall as gently as the river floods and recedes. Thousands of years will fold themselves up like linen laid away in a chest. If you drift off somewhere in the middle, that is not a failure of attention. That is the whole point. The story will keep unrolling quietly beneath your dreams, and you can come back another night and find the part you missed still waiting for you, patient as a stone lion in the sand. So settle your shoulders. Let your hands rest. Breathe out slowly, once, and let us begin where Egypt itself begins, which is not with pyramids or pharaohs at all, but with water. Long before there were any kings, before there was a single pyramid, before there was even a country called Egypt, there was the Nile. Picture it as slowly as you like. A river so long it seems to have no beginning, coming up out of the heart of Africa, out of great lakes and mountain ranges far to the south, and flowing north, always north, through a land of stone and sun. On either side of it lies desert, red and gold and empty, stretching farther than anyone in those days could walk in a lifetime. But along the river itself runs a narrow ribbon of green, sometimes only a few minutes' walk wide, black soiled and shaded with reeds and palms, and it is in that thin green ribbon that our whole story lives. The Egyptians would later call their country by two names. To the red desert on either side they gave one name, and to the black soil of the valley they gave another, and it was the black land, the good land, the flood-fed land, that they meant when they spoke of home. Every year, without fail, the river did something that must have seemed like a gift from the gods, because in a sense it was. In the heat of high summer, when the land was cracked and thirsty, the Nile would begin to rise. It rose slowly at first, then steadily, swelling over its banks, spreading out across the whole valley floor, until the fields vanished under a wide, calm sheet of brown water. And then, just as slowly, it would go down again, and when it did, it left behind a fresh layer of dark, rich silt, soft as new bread, carried all the way from those distant southern mountains. The people learned that if they scattered their seed into that black mud as the water withdrew, it would grow almost by itself. Barley and wheat came up thick and green. And a place where grain grows easily is a place where people can stop wandering, where they can build, where they can dream past the next meal. So they gathered along the river. In the beginning they were small bands of hunters and fishers, following the animals that came to drink, spearing fish in the shallows, gathering the eggs of water birds among the reeds. There were crocodiles in that river, long and patient, and hippopotamuses that could crush a reed boat with a yawn. And in the marshes there were clouds of ducks and geese that lifted off the water at dusk, in numbers that darkened the sky. Slowly, over generations too many to count, these wandering people learned to stay. They learned to keep cattle, long-horned and gentle, and to pen sheep and goats. They learned to bake the barley into flat loaves, and to brew it into a thick, mild beer that everyone drank, from children to elders, because it was safer than the river and it filled the belly. They learned to shape the river clay into pots, and to fire those pots hard in the sun and in the flame, and to paint them with reddish slip and burnished black rims. They learned to spin flax into thread and weave it into linen, that cool white cloth that would clothe Egyptians for the whole of their history. Life settled into a rhythm as steady as the river itself. There was the season of the flood, when the water covered the land, and there was little to do but mend nets and tools and wait. There was the season of growing, when the fields lay green and the whole valley smelled of wet earth and crops. And there was the season of harvest and low water, when the grain was cut and threshed and carried into storehouses, and the river shrank back into its channel, patient, gathering itself to rise again. 3 seasons, over and over, year after year, for a span of time so long it makes the mind go soft to think of it. And in that long, slow rhythm, the villages grew. Little clusters of mud brick houses rose along the banks, plastered smooth, cool inside against the heat of the day. People began to bury their dead with care, not simply laid in the ground, but curled on their sides as if sleeping, facing the setting sun, with a few pots of food and a favourite comb or a string of beads, in case the sleeper should wake somewhere and be hungry, or wish to look well. Even then, at the very beginning, you can see the Egyptians reaching gently toward the idea that death might not be the end, only a longer kind of night, with a morning somewhere on the far side of it. Now the valley was very long, hundreds of miles of it, and over time the many villages began to gather themselves into 2 larger worlds. In the south, upriver, where the valley was narrow and the water ran between cliffs of golden stone, the people came together under chiefs and wore a tall white crown shaped a little like a bowling pin. This was Upper Egypt, and though it lay in the south it was called Upper, because the river flowed down out of it, and to an Egyptian, up always meant toward the source. In the north downriver, the Nile did a remarkable thing. It fanned out. Instead of one channel it split into many, spreading across a wide, flat, marshy triangle of land before it reached the sea, a green delta of reeds and channels and rich black fields shaped, if you looked at it from high above, like an open flower or the broad head of a papyrus stalk. This was Lower Egypt, low because it lay at the river's mouth, and its people wore a different crown, a red one, low and curved with a tall spike rising at the back. 2 lands, then, the narrow green south under its white crown, and the wide green north under its red one. For a long while they went their separate ways, trading, sometimes squabbling, each with its own towns and its own gods and its own way of doing things. And then, sometime around 5,000 years ago, give or take, a king came out of the south with the will to join them. His name has come down to us worn and uncertain, as names do from that distance. Some called him Nama, some called him Menes, and it is possible they were 2 names for one man, or 2 men whose deeds were braided together by later memory. It does not matter greatly for our purposes tonight. What matters is the thing he did. He led his people north, down the long green corridor of the valley, and he brought Lower Egypt under his hand, and for the first time the whole length of the river, from the cliffs of the south to the marshes of the delta, answered to a single king. We have a small, beautiful object that seems to remember this. It is a flat plate of dark green stone, carved on both sides, a little taller than a man's forearm, made to grind the paint that lined the eyes of a god statue. On one side the king wears the white crown of the south, and raises a mace over a kneeling enemy. On the other side he wears the red crown of the north, and walks in procession past the bodies of the fallen, while his standard bearers march before him. The white crown and the red crown, on one man, on one stone. Whether or not the union happened exactly as that carving says, the idea it carries would last for 3,000 years. From that day the king of Egypt would be called the Lord of the 2 lands, and on his brow, at the great moments, he would wear a double crown, the red and the white nested together, a single object made of 2. To say without words that the river ran whole from the mountains to the sea, and that one hand held it all. So Egypt was born, not in a single day, but in a long, slow gathering, the way the silt gathers, the way the villages gathered, the way the 2 crowns gathered onto one head. And with the country came kings, and with kings came the need to write things down. This is another gift we can lay at the feet of that early age, quietly, before we move on. The Egyptians learned to write. They did not scratch out plain letters as we do. Instead they drew little pictures, hundreds of them, an owl, a foot, a coiled rope, a seated man, a loaf of bread, a rippling line of water, and they arranged these pictures in rows and columns to stand sometimes for the thing shown, and sometimes for the sound of its name. We call this writing hieroglyphs, which is a Greek word meaning sacred carvings, because the Greeks who saw it much later found it carved on temple walls, and assumed, rightly, that it was holy. To the Egyptians themselves it was the words of the gods. With it they could keep accounts of grain and cattle, record the years of a king's reign, write the names of the dead so those names would not be forgotten, and carve upon the walls of tombs the spells that would guide a sleeper safely through the long night on the far side of death. A civilization that can write down what it knows does not have to learn everything over again in each generation. It can remember. It can stack knowledge the way it stacks bricks, one course upon another, higher and higher. And Egypt, blessed with its patient river and its dark good soil, and now its sacred writing, was about to begin stacking. Let us walk forward then gently into the age when the Egyptians first learned to build in stone, and to raise, out of that red and gold desert, the strangest and most enduring shapes that human hands have ever made. The first kings after the Union ruled from a city in the north called Memphis, set near the point where the valley opens out into the delta, so that a man standing there had the narrow south at his back and the wide north before him, and could keep watch over both. Memphis would be Egypt's heart for a very long time, a white-walled city of temples and workshops and granaries, loud with the lowing of cattle and the ring of coppersmiths, cool with the shade of sycamore trees. And the kings who ruled from it began, slowly, to make their power visible in the one material that would outlast them all, which was stone. For a long time the Egyptians had buried even their kings in low rectangular tombs of mud brick, flat-topped and sloping-sided, like broad benches sitting on the desert edge above the town of the living. We call these tombs by an Arabic word mastaba, which means bench, because that is what they look like. They were handsome enough, but they were low, and they were mud, and mud does not defy the centuries. Then, a little under 5,000 years ago, there came a king named Jose, and beside that king there stood a man whose name we should say gently, because it is one of the first names of a private person to survive from the whole of human history. His name was Imhotep. He was not born a king or a prince. He rose by his gifts. He was the king's chief builder, his high priest, his physician, his advisor. A man so wise that Egyptians remembered him for thousands of years and at last worshipped him as a god of healing and of learning. And it was Imhotep, working for Djoser, who had an idea that changed the shape of the world. He began, as builders had always begun, with a stone mastaba but larger than usual, and made not of mud but of cut limestone blocks, small ones at first, about the size of the mud bricks his workmen were used to, as if he were teaching stone to behave like clay. And then, instead of stopping, he built another mastaba on top of the first, smaller, and another on top of that, smaller still, and another, 6 great steps in all, rising in stages toward the sky. When it was finished, it stood taller than anything human beings had ever built, a stairway of stone climbing more than 200 feet into the desert air above a place we now call Saqqara. It is the Step Pyramid, and it still stands today, the oldest large stone building in the world, more than 4,500 years old, weathered and golden, exactly where Imhotep set it. Think of what it must have been to see it new, its casing pale and smooth, gleaming above the flat brown town, the first time human eyes had ever looked up at a mountain made on purpose. The Egyptians had learned that they could shape stone into permanence, and having learned it, they did not stop. Djoser's successors kept trying. One king built a pyramid whose sides begin steep, and then, part way up, tilt back to a gentler slope, giving it a strange bent profile that has survived for us to puzzle over, as if the builders had lost their nerve, or learned something halfway, and decided to finish more cautiously than they had begun. That same king, whose name was Sneferu, did not give up. He built again, and this time he got it right, raising the first true smooth-sided pyramid, a clean triangular mountain of pale stone that pointed like a single unbroken line at the sun. Sneferu, it turned out, was the father of the man who would build the greatest of them all. That man was Khufu, and the pyramid he raised on the plateau of Giza, on the desert edge above Memphis, is the one the whole world still means when it says the word pyramid. Let us slow down here and stand before it, because it deserves our full and unhurried attention. When it was finished, the Great Pyramid rose 480 feet into the air, as tall as a modern building of 40 stories, and it would remain the tallest structure made by human hands for nearly 4,000 years, until the great cathedrals of Europe finally reached past it. It is built of more than 2 million blocks of stone, some of them weighing as much as several elephants, cut and dragged and lifted and fitted together so precisely that in many places you cannot slide the blade of a knife between them. Its base is nearly level across a footprint large enough to hold several city blocks, and its sides are aligned almost perfectly to the 4 directions, to true north and south and east and west, with an accuracy that seems impossible for people who had no compass and no machines. And here is the thing worth carrying with you into sleep. It was not built by armies of enslaved captives cracking under the whip, as old stories like to say. It was built by Egyptians, by tens of thousands of ordinary men who came in from the fields during the season of the flood, when the water lay over the land and there was no farming to be done, and who worked in organised gangs with cheerful names they gave themselves, names like the Friends of Khufu and the Drunkards of the Pyramid, and who were fed on bread and beer and onions and, on good days, roasted meat, and who lived in a whole town built for them beside the site, with bakeries and breweries and their own small hospital for setting broken bones. They were paid in food and cloth and honour. When one of them died on the job, he was buried nearby in his own modest tomb, his title carved above him, a builder of the mountain of the king. They knew they were making something that would never be equalled, and they signed their gang's names in red paint high inside the pyramid, where they never expected anyone to look again, and where we found them, thousands of years later, like a message left for us in the dark. Why did they do it? Why pour a nation's whole strength for decades into a single tomb? To understand that, you have to understand what the Egyptians believed the king was. He was not merely a ruler. He was the living link between the people and the gods, the one man who kept the whole delicate order of the world in balance, who made sure the sun rose and the river flooded and the grain grew and truth held its place against chaos. They had a word for that right order of things. They called it Mart, and it meant truth and justice and balance and the proper way that everything ought to be, all at once in a single word. The king's task above every other was to uphold Mart, and when the king died, he did not simply cease. He became one with the gods, rose to join the imperishable stars that wheel around the northern sky and never set, and from there he went on protecting his people forever. The pyramid was the machine that lifted him there, its slanting sides perhaps a ramp for his soul to climb, its stupendous mass a statement in stone that this man's death was not an ending but a passage into eternity, and that Egypt itself, held up by him, would endure just as the mountain endured. 2 more great pyramids rose beside Khufu's on the Giza plateau, one for his son and one for his grandson, along with the smaller pyramids of their queens, and the long causeways and temples where the funeral rites were performed. And guarding them, carved out of a single vast outcrop of living rock, there crouched a lion the size of a small hill, with the calm face of a king gazing steadily east toward the rising sun. We call it the Sphinx. It has sat there through more than 4,000 sunrises times 1,000, its paws stretched out before it, its features softened by the wind, half buried in sand for centuries at a time, and then dug free again, watching, patient, the oldest colossal statue on earth. Picture it now in the moonlight, the 3 pyramids sharp against the stars, the great stone lion below them keeping its long watch, the desert utterly silent, the river a thread of reflected sky far off in the dark, all of it built by people who wanted, more than anything, to hold on to the ones they loved and honoured past the reach of death, and who believed that if they built well enough and truly enough, they could. That age of the great pyramids we call the Old Kingdom, and it was the first golden age of Egypt, a time of confidence and enormous strength, of art so fine and so calm that it set the pattern for everything the Egyptians would make for the next 3,000 years. But no age lasts forever, not even one that builds in stone. The Old Kingdom had stood for centuries on a simple bargain. The king upheld the order of the world, and in return the whole country poured its labour into his glory and his tomb. But as the generations passed, that bargain slowly loosened. The kings gave gifts of land and gold to the nobles and priests who served them, and those gifts, once given, tended to stay in the family. Over time, the great provincial lords grew rich and proud in their own districts, building fine tombs for themselves far from the king's city, ruling their stretch of the river almost like small kings in their own right. The central treasury, meanwhile, had been drained by the enormous cost of all that building. And then, as if to remind everyone how fragile the whole arrangement truly was, the river itself faltered. For a stretch of years the floods came weak and low, or failed to come at all. The silt did not spread, the grain did not rise thick and green. And in a land that lived entirely on the mercy of one river, a few bad floods in a row meant hunger, and hunger meant that people began to ask, quietly at first and then aloud, what good was a king who was supposed to command the flood if the flood no longer came? The old certainty cracked. The last kings of the Old Kingdom faded into a long line of rulers so brief and so powerless that later Egyptians could barely remember their names, and the country slipped apart into its provinces, each lord looking to his own, the roads unsafe, the tombs of the ancestors robbed, the great machine of the state ground to a stop. We call this stretch of trouble the First Intermediate Period, which is a mild scholarly name for what was, for many people, a frightening time. And yet, and this is worth resting on for a moment, it was not only darkness. Something tender happened in those hard years. When the god-king seemed to have failed, ordinary people began to reach toward the gods more directly, on their own behalf. The comforts of eternity, once reserved almost entirely for the king and his circle, began to spread outward to humbler folk, who now hoped that they too might live again beyond death if they had lived rightly. Writers of that age left behind poems and laments and wise sayings, some of them aching with sorrow at a world turned upside down, others quietly insisting that a good name and a kind heart outlast gold. It was, in its way, a deepening. The suffering taught the Egyptians to look inward, and the literature that came out of it would be treasured for the rest of their history. But no people can live forever in disorder, and eventually, as always seems to happen along that river, a strong family rose to gather the pieces back together. This time the strength came from the south, from a city called Thebes, far up the valley, a place that until then had been a modest provincial town, but was about to become one of the most magnificent cities the world has ever seen. A line of Theban rulers, patient and determined, extended their power northward, war by war and treaty by treaty, until once again the whole river answered to a single hand. A king of Thebes reunited the two lands, and Egypt woke, as it were, from a troubled sleep into a second great age that we call the Middle Kingdom. If the Old Kingdom was the age of confidence, of raising mountains toward the sun without a shadow of doubt, the Middle Kingdom was the age of wisdom, of a country that had known suffering, and come through it changed, more thoughtful, more attentive to justice, more concerned with the ordinary person. The kings of this age still built pyramids, though smaller ones, often of mud brick faced with stone rather than solid stone throughout, for they had learned to spend their resources with more care. But their real energy went into governing well. They pushed back the borders and secured them. They sent expeditions south into the land of Nubia, up the river beyond the cataracts, where the Nile churns white over granite, to guard the trade in gold and ebony and ivory and incense that flowed down from the heart of Africa. They built a chain of great mud-brick fortresses along that southern frontier, massive walls with towers and dry moats and covered stairways down to the water, so that no boat could pass unwatched. They dug and cleared a channel through the worst of the cataract so that ships could be hauled up past the rapids. And in the delta and the fields they turned their attention to the water itself, draining marshes, digging canals, and above all developing a great low-lying basin off to the west of the river, a natural depression fed by a branch of the Nile, which they turned into a vast reservoir and a rich province of gardens and grain. They were these Middle Kingdom kings, engineers of the ordinary and the useful, and their people prospered. One of them, a king named Senusret, was remembered so long and so fondly that centuries later the Greeks told tall tales of a mighty conqueror by a version of his name who had supposedly marched to the ends of the earth. The truth was quieter and better. He and his line gave Egypt generations of good harvests, safe roads, fair courts, and a flowering of art and writing that Egyptians ever afterward regarded as the purest form of their language, the classical age against which all later writing was measured. It was in the Middle Kingdom that a story was written down that people still read today, the tale of a court official who flees Egypt in a panic after overhearing something he should not have, and spends long years in exile among the desert peoples to the east, growing rich and honoured there, marrying, raising sons, becoming a great man in a foreign land, and yet never for a single day ceasing to ache for home, for the black soil and the river and the particular smell of an Egyptian morning. In his old age the king forgives him and calls him back, and the traveller weeps to cross the border again, and is bathed and dressed in fine linen and given a proper tomb, so that he may at last, when his time comes, sleep in the land that made him. It is a story about homesickness and mercy, and the deep pull of the place where you belong, and the fact that it survived for nearly 4,000 years, copied and recopied by student after student, tells you something about the Egyptians. They were a people who loved their home with a quiet, unshakable love, who could not imagine a fate worse than dying far from the Nile, and who believed, above all, in coming home. That is a gentle thought to carry a little way into the night. The Middle Kingdom, too, would eventually weaken, as ages do, its late kings growing brief and uncertain, the central grip loosening once more. And while it faded, something new was quietly happening in the northeastern delta, where over the years many people from the lands to the east, from the direction of what we now call the Near East, had settled among the Egyptians, herders and traders and craftsmen, until in some towns they were the majority. These newcomers were not conquerors at first. They came in peace, seeking pasture and work, as people had always come to Egypt in hard times, because Egypt, with its faithful river, so rarely starved. But as the kings in the south grew weak, the leaders of these eastern settlers in the north grew strong, and eventually they set themselves up as kings in the delta, ruling a good part of Lower Egypt for several generations. Later Egyptians would remember them with a shudder as foreign rulers, and would give them a name that meant, roughly, chiefs of foreign lands. But here again the truth is gentler than the memory. These rulers admired Egypt and imitated it. They took Egyptian names and titles, worshipped Egyptian gods, wrote in Egyptian, and kept the old ways going. And they brought new things with them, useful things, that Egypt absorbed and made its own, including a technology that would change how wars were fought all across the ancient world. That new thing was the horse, and with it the light war chariot, a small, fast platform on two spoked wheels, drawn by a pair of horses, carrying a driver and an archer, quick and deadly across the flat ground. The Egyptians had never seen anything like it. They had fought on foot, with spears and axes and bows, marching in ranks. And now here were these swift-wheeled machines that could wheel around a slow line of infantry and pour arrows into it and be gone before a blow could land. It was a shock, and it was a lesson, and the Egyptians, as they always did with foreign gifts, took the lesson to heart. Down in the south, in Thebes, a proud line of native kings had never accepted the foreign rulers in the north. For years they seethed, paying grudging respect, biding their time, and at last they began to fight back. The war of liberation took more than one reign to win. One southern king fell in battle against the northerners, and we have his very body, and his skull shows the terrible wounds of the axe and the spear that killed him, so that even now, across more than 3,000 years, we can see exactly how hard that fight was and what it cost. But his sons carried it on, and the last of them, a determined young king named Mose, finally drove the foreign rulers out of the delta and back across the eastern frontier, chased them into their strongholds, and broke their power for good. And having reunited the two lands for the third time in Egypt's long story, Moses did not stop at the border as his ancestors had so often done. He and the kings who followed him had learned something in those bitter years. They had learned that Egypt was not as safe as it had always believed, that a determined enemy could come down out of the northeast and take the richest part of the country, and that the old policy of sitting behind the deserts and trusting the river to keep the world away was no longer enough. So the new line of kings decided that Egypt would be safe only if the lands beyond its borders were held firmly in Egyptian hands, if the buffer was pushed far, far out, deep into the lands to the northeast and deep to the south. And with that decision, Egypt became, for the first and only time in its long history, a conquering empire. This third great age we call the New Kingdom, and it is the age of everything you probably picture when you think of ancient Egypt at its height. The soaring temples with their forests of painted columns, the golden treasures, the great warrior pharaohs riding to battle in gleaming chariots, the tombs cut deep into a lonely desert valley and painted with the whole journey of the soul. It is the most brilliant, wealthy, and famous chapter of the entire story, and it lasted for around 500 years, and it produced a run of rulers so remarkable that we could spend the rest of the night on them alone. Let us walk among a few of them, slowly, and let the others rest. Early in this age there rose a ruler unlike any Egypt had seen, because this pharaoh was a woman. Her name was Hatshepsut. She was the daughter of a king, the wife of a king, and when her husband died, leaving only a young stepson as heir, a child too small to rule, she stepped in first as regent, governing on the boy's behalf, and then, quietly and without a drop of blood spilled, she took the full title and power of Pharaoh for herself. This was a delicate and daring thing. Egypt had almost always been ruled by men, and the very idea of kingship was wrapped up in male images and male gods. Hatshepsut solved this not by pretending to be something she was not, but by wrapping herself in the full traditional regalia of a pharaoh, including the ceremonial false beard that every king wore as a symbol of the office, and by having herself shown in the ancient royal poses, so that in the language of art and ritual she was simply the king, doing what kings do. And she did it very well. Her reign was not a reign of war, but of peace and wealth and beauty. She poured Egypt's strength into trade and building rather than conquest. Her most famous act was to send a great expedition far to the south, down the Red Sea to a distant land the Egyptians called Punt, a place of marvels somewhere along the coast of Africa, to bring back the treasures that could not be had at home. And her fleet returned laden with gold and ebony and ivory and leopard skins, and most precious of all, with living incense trees. Their roots balled in baskets, to be planted in the gardens of the gods, so that Egypt would never run short of the fragrant resin that rose in sweet smoke before the altars. She had the whole story of that voyage carved in delicate relief on the walls of the temple she built for herself, and there among the ships and the sailors and the strange foreign huts on stilts, we can still see the ruler of the faraway land and his wife, drawn with such honest and affectionate detail that it feels less like propaganda than like a traveller's delighted sketch of people he found genuinely wonderful. That temple of hers is one of the loveliest buildings ever raised. It stands against a wall of golden cliffs across the river from Thebes, a series of broad columned terraces climbing the desert in clean horizontal lines, so perfectly matched to the mountain behind it that the work of human hands and the work of the earth seem to be one thing. To stand before it at dawn, when the low sun turns the cliffs to fire and the long shadows stretch across the terraces, is to feel the calm, ordered confidence of a great ruler who had nothing to prove and everything to celebrate. Hatshepsut ruled for around 20 years, and Egypt grew fat and happy under her care. When she died, her stepson at last came into his own, and he turned out to be one of the greatest warrior kings in all of Egyptian history. His name was Thutmose, the third king to carry it. And if Hatshepsut was Egypt's builder of peace, he was its maker of empire. In the very first year after he took full power, the princes of the lands to the northeast sensing perhaps that a new and untested king was on the throne, banded together in revolt and gathered a great army at a fortress town beside a mountain pass. The young pharaoh marched to meet them, and when his generals reached the mountains they found 3 roads leading toward the enemy, 2 of them wide and safe, and one of them a narrow track through a gorge so tight that the men would have to go single file where an ambush could destroy them. His cautious advisers begged him to take one of the broad roads. He chose the narrow one, precisely because the enemy would never expect it, and he rode at the front himself, and his army threaded the gorge unharmed and burst out onto the plain before the astonished foe, and won a great victory that made Egypt the master of the region for generations. He was that kind of king, bold and brilliant and tireless. Over the years he led campaign after campaign, more than a dozen in all, marching out each dry season and coming home each flood, extending Egypt's power farther than it had ever reached, north to the great river of the Near East and south deep into Nubia, until tribute flowed into Thebes from 100 subject lands, gold and silver and horses and cedar timber and lapis lazuli and captives and exotic beasts. He was careful as well as bold. He did not simply crush the conquered lands, but took the sons of their princes as honoured hostages, raised them at the Egyptian court, taught them Egyptian ways, and then sent them home to rule as loyal friends of Egypt, a wise and gentle sort of conquest that bound the empire together with ties of upbringing and affection as much as fear. He had the records of his campaigns carved on the walls of the great temple at Thebes, dry and precise as a good officer's diary, and he gave a share of his plunder to the gods, so that the temples grew richer and grander with every victory. Under him and his son and grandson, Egypt reached the very summit of its wealth and power, and that wealth found its fullest and most golden expression in the reign of a later king named Amenhotep, the third of that name, who came to the throne when the empire was so secure that he barely needed to fight at all, and who spent his long, sunlit reign simply enjoying and adorning the greatest kingdom on earth. He built on a scale that staggers the eye even now. He raised a temple to the gods so vast that only fragments of it survive, guarded once by 2-seated statues of himself so colossal that they still sit there today at the edge of the fields, weathered giants gazing east across the river, taller than a house, so famous in later ages that Greek and Roman tourists came from across the world to marvel at them and scratch their names on the ankles. The way tourists always have, he dug a great pleasure lake for his queen, a woman named Tie, whom he loved and honoured above all others, and whose strong, intelligent face looks out at us still from her portraits, and he had a huge scarab beetle carved in stone to commemorate the digging of it, and he recorded that the lake was finished, and that he sailed upon it with the queen in the royal barge on a festival evening. Imagine that scene as you drift, the wide artificial lake catching the last gold of the sunset, the painted barge gliding across it, the king and his clever queen side by side beneath an awning, musicians playing softly, the whole of the richest empire on earth at peace around them, and no shadow yet of what was coming. And here we should pause and stand for a while in the great city of this golden age, in Thebes, the capital of the empire, the wealthiest and most magnificent city in the world in its day, for it deserves a slow and unhurried look. It lay far up the river in the south, on both banks, and it was really 2 cities facing each other across the water. The city of the living on the eastern bank where the sun rose, and the city of the dead on the western bank where the sun set. On the eastern side stood the temples, and chief among them was the vast home of the great chief god of the empire, a temple complex so enormous that it grew over the centuries into the largest religious building ever raised by human hands, a place where pharaoh after pharaoh, for well over 1,000 years, added his own hall, his own gateway, his own avenue, his own towering pair of needle-sharp stone obelisks sheathed in gleaming gold at the tip to catch the first light of the sun. At its heart rose a hall of columns so many and so huge that it staggers belief even in ruin, a stone forest of enormous painted pillars, each so thick that many people with joined hands can barely encircle one, rising higher than a modern building of several stories, their tops spreading like the flowers of the papyrus and the lotus, the whole ceiling once painted deep blue and spangled with golden stars so that a worshipper walking through that dim, towering, star-roofed forest of stone felt himself to be walking at the very dawn of the world among the first plants that ever grew out of the waters of creation. Between this great temple and another to the south ran a paved processional avenue more than a mile long, lined the whole way on both sides with hundreds of carved stone sphinxes crouching in endless ranks, and along that avenue once a year. At the great festival, the statue of the god was carried in triumph from his temple to visit the southern one, through streets packed with the entire population of the city, in a blaze of incense and music and rejoicing. And across the river, on the western bank, in the shadow of the golden cliffs, lay the whole vast machinery of eternity. There stood the memorial temples of the pharaohs, where their spirits would be honoured forever with daily offerings. There lay the neat walled village of the tomb workers whose ordinary lives we have already walked through. And there, hidden away in a lonely sun-baked valley behind the cliffs, secret and guarded, the pharaohs of the empire had abandoned the old idea of the pyramid, which had proved to be nothing but a great stone arrow pointing robbers to the treasure, and instead cut their tombs deep and hidden into the living rock, long sloping corridors and stairways descending far into the mountain to a hidden burial chamber, the walls the whole way down painted with the maps and the spells of the soul's night journey through the underworld toward rebirth with thee. Rising sun. This is the famous Valley of the Kings, and into its silent rock were laid, one after another, the greatest rulers of Egypt's greatest age, in secret, with all their treasure, in the vain and touching hope that here, at last, hidden in the heart of the mountain, they would be safe. And in the great days, before the lean years and the robbers came, that whole western shore must have been a place of extraordinary solemn beauty, the memorial temples gleaming white along the desert edge, the golden cliffs rising behind, the smoke of 1,000 offerings drifting up, the priests chanting the names of the dead kings so that those names would never be forgotten, the whole city of the dead alive with the patient work of keeping the pharaohs safe on the far side of the sunset. Hold that picture as you drift, the two cities facing each other across the shining river, the living and the dead, the sunrise and the sunset. The star-roofed forest of stone columns on the one bank and the hidden valley of the sleeping kings on the other, and between them the calm water flowing north, as it always flowed, carrying the light of the setting sun downstream toward the distant sea. Because a shadow was coming, or at least a very strange and beautiful storm. When Amenhotep died, his son came to the throne, and that son had ideas that would shake Egypt to its ancient roots. He began his reign in the ordinary way, under his given name, but within a few years he did something no pharaoh had ever done. Egypt had always worshipped many gods, hundreds of them, great and small, each with its temples and priests and festivals, a whole crowded, comfortable, familiar heaven that had been in place for thousands of years. The new king turned away from all of it. He declared that there was truly only one God worth worshipping, a single divine power whose visible form was the disk of the sun itself, the source of all light and life, which the Egyptians called the Aten. He changed his own name to mean one who is useful to the Aten, a name we render as Akhenaten. He closed the temples of the other gods, or let them fall idle, cut off their funds, and even sent men to chisel out the name of the old chief god of Thebes from the monuments across the land, so deep did his zeal run. And then, because he could not remake the ancient priestly city of Thebes to suit his new faith, he did something breathtaking. He built himself an entirely new capital city, from nothing, on a virgin stretch of desert halfway down the river, a place no god had ever claimed, and he named it the Horizon of the Aten, and he moved his court and his government there, and swore never to leave its boundaries. In that new city, for a single glittering generation, everything was different. The art changed. For thousands of years, Egyptian art had shown its kings as idealized, ageless, perfect, calm. Now the royal family was shown in a startling new way, with long faces and heavy lips and soft bellies and slender limbs, relaxed and human and intimate, the king and his beautiful queen Nefertiti dandling their small daughters on their knees, kissing them, playing with them, all bathed in the rays of the sun disk, whose every ray ended in a tiny reaching hand offering the sign of life. It was warm and tender and unlike anything before or after, and Nefertiti, whose painted bust with its swan neck and serene, perfect face was found in a sculptor's workshop in the ruins of that city, remains after 3,000 years one of the most famous and beautiful faces in the world. There was real feeling in it, a genuine reaching toward a purer and simpler idea of the divine, and Akhenaten wrote or inspired a great hymn to the sun, praising the god who makes the chick speak within the egg and gives breath to all that lives, a poem of such beauty that it can still move a reader today. But it could not last. Whatever its beauty, the new faith was the vision of one man, imposed from the top, and it left the ordinary Egyptian cold. The people had loved their many gods, their local shrines, their familiar festivals, the comfortable certainty that 100 divine helpers watched over the small troubles of daily life. They did not want a single distant sun disk that only the king could truly approach. The neglected priests seethed. The empire abroad, left to drift while the king gazed at his god, began to fray at the edges. Subject cities writing desperate letters begging for help against their enemies, letters that piled up unanswered in the archives of the dreamed city. And when Akhenaten died, the whole strange experiment collapsed almost at once, like a held breath let go. The son who followed Akhenaten was only a small child, born in the dream city, raised in the new faith, given a name that honoured the sun disk. But the men who ruled in his name knew which way the wind had turned. Within a few years the boy king's name was changed to honour the old chief god instead, becoming the name by which the whole world now knows him. Tutankhamun. The court abandoned the dreamed city in the desert, left it to the sand, and returned to the ancient centres. The old gods were restored, their temples reopened and refunded, their priests welcomed back, and the great strange experiment of the one sun god was quietly buried and in time deliberately erased. Later kings struck Akhenaten's name from the official lists as though he had never reigned, called him only the enemy or the heretic, and tried to make the whole episode vanish from memory. And here is one of the great gentle ironies of history. The boy king Tutankhamun, who reigned only briefly and died very young, perhaps not yet 20, and who was so minor in his own time that later Egyptians forgot him entirely, became, more than 3,000 years later, the most famous pharaoh of them all, and the reason is simple and quiet. His tomb was small, and it was hidden, and it was almost the only royal tomb in all of Egypt that grave robbers never found. Every other great pharaoh, every warrior king and pyramid builder had his tomb stripped of its treasures within a few centuries of his burial, sometimes within a few years. But the little tomb of the forgotten boy was covered over by the rubble of a later king's building work and lay undisturbed in the darkness for 33 centuries, until one day a patient searcher, after years of finding nothing, uncovered a single step cut into the valley floor, and then another, and then a sealed door, and beyond it a passage, and beyond that a room. And when he made a small hole and held up a candle, and someone behind him asked whether he could see anything, he answered, wonderful things. The chamber was packed with the golden furniture of a king's eternity, gilded couches and chariots and thrones and statues and chests, and at the heart of it nested one inside another like the layers of a seed, the coffins of the young king. The innermost one made of gold, and over his face a mask of gold and blue glass and precious stones so serenely beautiful that it has become the very image of ancient Egypt in the mind of the whole modern world. All that for a boy who barely reigned. Imagine what the tomb of a truly great pharaoh must have held before the robbers came. Rest on that thought a while. The riches of Egypt were beyond counting, and almost all of them are gone, melted down and scattered in the dark of history, and what little we have is only the crumbs that the thieves missed. After the boy king and a few short reigns of steadying, a new and vigorous family took the throne, army men, practical and strong. And they set about restoring Egypt's power and pride. The greatest of them, and one of the longest reigning and most famous kings in all of history, was Ramesses, the second of that name, whom later ages called Ramesses the Great. He ruled for an astonishing 66 years, so long that many of his subjects lived their entire lives and died without ever knowing another pharaoh, so long that he outlived a dozen of his own sons. He fathered scores of children. He built more monuments, more temples, more colossal statues of himself than any other king, until his name and his image are scattered the whole length of Egypt, carved so deep and so often that it is nearly impossible to travel the river without meeting his enormous stone face gazing down. Far to the south, in Nubia, he cut an entire temple out of a cliff of living rock, its front guarded by 4-seated statues of himself, each as tall as a 6-story building, and he aligned it so cunningly that twice a year the rising sun shoots straight down the long dark passage and lights up the gods enthroned in the deepest chamber. Early in his reign he fought the most famous battle of the age against the great rival empire of the north, at a city called Kadesh, and he very nearly lost it. He had marched ahead too fast with only part of his army, was lured forward by false reports, and found himself and his household troops suddenly surrounded by the enemy's chariots with his other divisions too far back to help. By his own account, and he had it carved everywhere in triumph, he rallied his men and fought like a lion and broke out and turned near disaster into a draw. The truth is that neither side truly won, and years later the two great powers, both exhausted, signed a treaty of peace and friendship. The oldest surviving peace treaty in the world, its careful clauses of mutual defence and the return of fugitives preserved on the temple walls of Egypt and on a clay tablet in the archives of the Northern Empire, so that we have, remarkably, both copies of the same ancient promise. And the peace held. To seal it, Ramesses married a princess of the former enemy and welcomed her to Egypt with great ceremony, and for the rest of his very long life the northern frontier was quiet. He grew old, and older, a living monument, his hair gone white, his body bent and aching. We can see the arthritis in his very bones, still reigning, still building, until at last he died in extreme old age and was buried with all the pomp his endless reign could muster. His mummy survives, a small, dignified old man with a great hooked nose and folded arms, and looking at his calm dead face, it is strange to think that this is the actual man before whom whole nations trembled, the great king of the Age of Gold. His son and successor, already an old man himself by the time his father finally died, had to fight off a frightening invasion by a coalition of restless seafaring peoples and land migrants who were in those years boiling up out of the north and west and crashing against every kingdom of the eastern Mediterranean, toppling empires as they came. Egypt, under this son, and later under another strong king of the same family, met these sea peoples in great battles on land and, remarkably, in a pitched battle in the very mouths of the Nile, and beat them back, and survived when older and prouder kingdoms all around were going down in fire and never rising again. But the effort cost Egypt dearly, and the world it had known was changing. The great age of empire was ending, all across the region, and Egypt, though it endured, would never again be quite so rich, so bold, or so young. Before we follow Egypt down out of its golden noon toward the long, mellow evening of its history, let us pause here, in the middle of the new kingdom, and simply live in it for a while, quietly, the way you might linger in a warm room before going up to bed. Let us set the kings aside for a moment and walk through an ordinary Egyptian day, because the true wonder of this civilization is not only its pharaohs, but the settled, gentle, deeply human life that went on beneath them, year after year, for 3,000 years. Come with me to a small village on the western side of the river across from Thebes, tucked into a fold of the desert hills, walled and neat, its narrow streets lined with little whitewashed houses set wall to wall. This is a real place, and we know it better than almost any other village in the entire ancient world. because the people who lived here were the very workmen who cut and painted the tombs of the pharaohs in the nearby valleys, and being literate craftsmen, they left behind mountains of notes, letters, laundry lists, love poems, court records, sick days, complaints, and gossip. Scribbled on flakes of white limestone and broken pottery, thousands upon thousands of them, so that we can almost hear these long dead people talking. A house here has a few small rooms, cool and dim, with a front room where the household shrine stands, and where a woman might give birth on a special raised bed. A living room with a low platform for sitting and sleeping. A kitchen open to the sky at the back with a clay oven and a grindstone for the daily flour, and a stair to the flat roof where the family sleeps on hot nights under the enormous desert stars. The man of the house rises before dawn, eats a little bread and drinks a little beer, and walks out with his gang over the hills to the royal tombs, carrying his copper chisels and his lamp, a small wick floating in oil with a pinch of salt to keep it from smoking, and there in the flickering dark he cuts and smooths and paints the walls of a king's eternity. And he grumbles. As workers always have, when the rations of grain and fish and vegetables and firewood come late, and once, when they came very late indeed, he and his fellows laid down their tools and marched to the temple and sat down and refused to move until they were paid. The first recorded labour strike in all of human history, so that even the invention of the sit-down protest belongs to these ordinary Egyptian craftsmen. Meanwhile, his wife is mistress of the house, and she holds a position of real dignity and freedom that women in most other ancient lands could only have envied. An Egyptian woman could own property and land in her own name, run a business, make contracts, go to court, inherit and bequeath, keep her own property in marriage, and take it with her if the marriage ended. She was not owned by her husband. Marriages were made by simple agreement and setting up house together, and dissolved the same way, and the poems these people left behind speak of love in words as fresh as this morning. A young man wishing he were the ring on his beloved's finger. A young woman lying awake sick with longing, wondering if he will come. They loved their children fiercely, and their pets, cats above all, sleek and half-sacred, and geese and dogs with names carved on their collars, and even, in the great houses, tame monkeys and gazelles. They played board games in the evening, a game of 30 squares where a piece moved by the throw of casting sticks. So beloved that they had it painted in their tombs and buried sets of it with their dead, so that the sleeper might have something to play through the long night. They loved music, the harp and the lute and the double pipe, and the rattle, and dancing and beer, and feasts where garlands of flowers were passed around, and a cone of scented fat was set on each guest's wig to melt slowly through the evening and perfume the air. And over all of this, woven through every hour of it, was the presence of the gods. The Egyptians did not keep religion in a separate box. It was simply how the world was made. The sun was a god crossing the sky in his boat by day, and battling through the underworld by night to be reborn each dawn. The river's flood was a god. The sky was a goddess arching her star-spangled body over the earth. There was a god of wisdom and writing with the head of a long-beaked bird, and a goddess of love and joy and music with the ears of a cow, and a jackal-headed god who watched over the dead and the embalmers, and a green-skinned god of the underworld who had once been a good king, murdered by his jealous brother, and lovingly reassembled and restored to a new life beyond death by his devoted wife, so that he became the first being ever to conquer death and the lord and hope of every Egyptian who died thereafter. For the Egyptians believed, more deeply and more elaborately than any people before them, that death was not the end. They believed that a person was made of several parts: the body, the name, the shadow, and 2 kinds of soul. And that if the body could be preserved, and the name remembered, and the proper spells provided, then the person could go on living, could rise each day like the sun, could dwell in a green and perfect version of Egypt called the Field of Reeds, ploughing and harvesting and feasting forever beside the ones they loved, under a sun that never scorched, beside a river that never failed. This is why they perfected the strange and patient art of mummification, drying the body with natron salt over 40 days, anointing it with fragrant oils and resins, wrapping it in hundreds of yards of fine linen with protective amulets tucked between the layers, and laying it in a painted coffin shaped like the sleeping owner, so that the soul, returning each night, would always find its home and know it. And they buried with the dead a scroll we call the Book of the Dead, which was really a book of coming forth by day, a collection of spells and passwords and maps to guide the soul safely through the dangers of the night country. The most famous scene from it, painted again and again, shows the moment of judgment. The dead person is led into a great hall before the throne of the Lord of the Dead, and there the heart, which the Egyptians believed to be the seat of the mind and the conscience, is taken out and set upon one pan of a great balance, and on the other pan is placed a single feather, the feather of truth, the symbol of that right order of the world, of Mart. If the heart is heavy with wrongdoing, it sinks, and a waiting monster devours it, and the person dies the second and final death. But if the heart is light as the feather, in balance with truth, then the person is declared true of voice and led forward into the everlasting fields. And the dead were coached, in that scroll, to speak a great declaration before the judges, swearing all the things they had not done, that they had not stolen, had not lied, had not killed, had not caused pain, had not taken food from the hungry or milk from the mouths of children, had not befouled the water or turned anyone away from their family. It is, if you read it slowly, one of the oldest and most touching descriptions of a decent human life that we possess, a portrait of goodness drawn in the negative, a person hoping to say at the end, I did no harm, I kept the balance, let me pass. Carry that with you as you drift. For all their strange gods and their golden kings, the ancient Egyptians hoped, in the end, for what we hope for, to have lived kindly, to be remembered, to sleep in peace and wake in a good place, beside the people we love, in the morning. Now let us return to the long thread of the kings and follow it down into the evening of Egypt's history, gently, because the evening of a great civilization has its own quiet beauty, like the last warm light on a wall after the sun has gone. The new kingdom did not end in a single crash. It faded, the way a fire settles into embers, over many slow rains. A long line of kings, all named Ramesses, the third and the fourth, and on, each less powerful than the last, presided over a country slowly running short of the wealth and confidence that had built it. The empire abroad slipped away, province by province, as Egypt lost its grip on the lands to the north and its garrisons came home. The great temples had grown so rich, and owned so much land and so many workers and so much gold, that the high priests who ran them became a power to rival the throne itself. And down in the tomb workers' village across from Thebes, times grew hard. The rations came late more and more often. Grain prices climbed. And in those lean years something happened that would have been unthinkable in the age of gold. People began to rob the royal tombs. Not foreign invaders, but Egyptians themselves, quietly, from the inside, tomb workers and officials and priests who knew exactly where the treasures lay and how to reach them. Slipping into the valley by night, breaking through the sealed doors, stripping the gold from the coffins of the great kings and melting it down. We have the actual court records of the trials, the confessions of the robbers taken under questioning, the lists of officials sent to inspect the violated tombs and report which ones were still intact and which had been plundered. It is a strange and melancholy thing to read, the Golden Age eating its own glory to survive the lean years. Eventually the priests who by then effectively ruled the south did a tender and practical thing. To save the bodies of the great pharaohs from further desecration, they gathered them up, the mummies of the mightiest kings of Egypt, the conqueror Thutmose, the great Ramesses, and many more. Rewrapped them with care, labelled each one, and hid them all together in a secret rock-cut tomb and in a deep shaft in the cliffs, where they lay hidden and safe for nearly 3,000 years, a whole dynasty of kings sleeping side by side in the dark, until modern searchers found them at last and brought them down the river to rest, at the end of everything, in glass cases in a museum. Still recognisably themselves, still bearing the faces that once ruled the world. With the throne so weak, Egypt quietly split again. The kings ruled the north from a city in the delta, and the high priests ruled the south from Thebes, and though they kept up the polite fiction of a single country, the two lands had drifted apart once more. This long, gentle, fragmented stretch we call the Third Intermediate Period, and it lasted for centuries, and it is a time of soft edges and blurred lines, of many rulers reigning at once in different cities, of Egypt no longer leading the world, but settling into a comfortable, dignified old age. And in these years the crown passed, without much fuss, to families who had come from elsewhere and become entirely Egyptian. For generations, soldiers from the lands to the west, the Libyans, had served in Egypt's armies and settled in the delta and married into the country, until their chiefs were among the most powerful men in Egypt, and in time one of them simply became pharaoh, founding a line of Libyan kings who wore the double crown and worshipped the Egyptian gods and ruled in the old way, so thoroughly Egyptian that only their names betrayed where their forefathers had come from. Egypt, you see, had a way of absorbing its newcomers, of quietly turning conquerors and settlers alike into Egyptians, of wrapping everyone who came in the same ancient linen of custom and belief. Then, from the far south, from deep in Nubia beyond the cataracts, there came a most remarkable thing. The land of Cush, which Egypt had once ruled and colonized and taught, which had taken in Egyptian gods and Egyptian writing and Egyptian ways so completely that its own kings built pyramids and worshipped the Egyptian gods more devoutly than the Egyptians themselves, now grew strong while Egypt grew weak. And the kings of Cush looked north at the disorder in the old motherland, at the squabbling delta princes and the neglected temples, and they decided, in a spirit that was almost pious, that it was their duty to march down the river and restore proper order and proper worship to Egypt. So a Cushite king came north with his army, not as a foreign destroyer, but as a devout reformer, and took control of the whole valley. And he and his successors ruled all of Egypt and Cush together as pharaohs, black African kings from the deep south wearing the double crown, restoring the old temples, reviving the old art in its purest classical forms, ruling with genuine reverence for the ancient traditions of the land they had come to save. It is one of the most surprising and least known chapters of the whole story, and one of the most poignant, this moment when the pupil became the guardian, when the far southern kingdom that Egypt had civilized returned the gift 1,000 years later by preserving Egypt's own heritage. But their reign fell in dangerous times. Far to the northeast a terrible new power had risen, the Empire of Assyria, the most fearsome war machine the world had yet seen, an empire that ruled by iron and terror and the deliberate, systematic cruelty of its armies. Egypt and Assyria came into conflict over the lands between them, and the Assyrians, with their disciplined troops and their iron weapons and their siege engines, were more than the Cushite pharaohs could withstand. The Assyrian king invaded Egypt itself, marched down the valley, sacked the delta cities, and eventually stormed even mighty Thebes, the city of 100 gates, the great and ancient capital of the south, and plundered it so thoroughly that the shock of it echoed across the whole ancient world for generations, a proverb of a proud city brought low. The Cushite kings withdrew back up the river to their southern homeland, where their remarkable civilization would live on for another 1,000 years, building its own pyramids in the sand far to the south. And Egypt, the oldest kingdom on earth, lay for a moment stunned and broken under the heel of a foreign conqueror. And yet, even now, Egypt was not finished. Because Egypt was never quite finished, not for thousands of years. Out of the wreckage the Assyrians left behind, a clever prince from a city in the delta named Sais rose up. He had at first been set over the north as a servant of the Assyrians, but as their vast empire began to strain and crack under its own weight far away in the east, he quietly gathered the fragments of Egypt back into his own hand, played the great powers against one another, hired tough mercenary soldiers from across the sea, and made himself the master of a free and reunited Egypt once more. And there followed, remarkably, one last true flowering, a bright, proud, nostalgic revival that we call the Site Renaissance, after his city. It was an age that fell in love with its own deep past, Egypt was by now unimaginably old, older to these people than the pyramids are to us, and its artists and priests looked back across 2,000 years to the pure, calm masterpieces of the Old and Middle Kingdoms and deliberately copied them, reviving ancient styles and ancient titles and ancient spellings, as if to say to the world, we are still here, we are still ourselves. We remember who we were. They opened the old tombs to study the old art. They wrote in a deliberately archaic hand. And Egypt grew rich again on trade, opening its ports to Greek merchants who came in growing numbers, founding a great trading city in the delta where Greeks and Egyptians lived and dealt side by side, so that for the first time the sharp, curious, restless Greeks got a long, close look at the ancient and mysterious land of the Nile, and went home full of wonder and wrote it all down, and much of what we long knew of Egypt came first through their astonished eyes. It was in this age that a Greek traveller and historian came up the river and marvelled at everything, at the pyramids, at the mummies, at the crocodiles and the strange customs, and famously called Egypt the gift of the river, and declared that the Egyptians were the most religious of all people and had more marvels in their land than any other, and wrote pages that people still read today. This last golden evening was calm and prosperous, but it fell in a world that had grown far larger and more dangerous than the old world of the Nile. Far to the east, a new empire had arisen greater than any before it, greater even than Assyria, the empire of Persia, which under its kings swallowed up the whole of the ancient East from the borders of India to the shores of the Mediterranean, kingdom after kingdom falling before it. And it was only a matter of time before that vast power turned its eye toward the ancient prize of Egypt. The Persian king came with an army so huge the old accounts strain to describe it, and though the Egyptians fought hard, they were overwhelmed, and Egypt became, for the first time in its immense history, simply a province, one satrapy among many, in a foreign empire ruled from a distant capital by a king who had never seen the Nile. The Persians, to be fair, mostly ruled with a light hand where they could. The wiser Persian kings took Egyptian titles, honoured the Egyptian gods, restored temples, and let the country keep its ancient ways, ruling through Egyptian officials and asking chiefly for their taxes and their grain. For Egypt was the richest granary in the world, and the Persians valued it greatly. But it was foreign rule, and the Egyptians, so proud, so ancient, so certain of their own centrality in the order of things, chafed under it bitterly. Again and again through the years of Persian domination they rose in revolt, sometimes with help from the Greeks, who were themselves locked in a long struggle against Persia. And for one last brief brave span of about 60 years, the Egyptians managed to throw off the Persian yoke entirely and rule themselves once more under native pharaohs, the very last native pharaohs Egypt would ever have. These final homeborn kings ruled from the cities of the Delta, and they fought hard to keep their freedom, hiring Greek generals and Greek soldiers, building up their defences, playing the endless game of alliance and betrayal among the great powers. And in the little time and money they had, they still built for the gods, raising graceful temples and gateways in the old style, adding their names to the endless stone record of the pharaohs, keeping the ancient flame alight for a few more years. The very last of them was a king who, when the Persians at last came back in overwhelming force to reclaim their lost province, fought as long as he could, and then, seeing that all was lost, gathered what treasure he could carry and sailed south, up the river into Nubia, into exile, and vanished from history, the final Egyptian to wear the double crown of the two lands by right of Egyptian birth. After more than 2,500 years, the long unbroken line of native pharaohs, which had begun with a king out of the south uniting the two lands with mace and crown, came quietly to its end, and the Persians ruled Egypt once more. But this second Persian rule was harsh and hated, and, as it turned out, brief, for the whole vast Persian Empire was about to be swept away in a storm out of the west, a storm that came in the person of one young man, perhaps the most famous conqueror who has ever lived. He was a Macedonian, a prince from the rough mountainous kingdom on the northern edge of the Greek world, and he had been taught as a boy by one of the greatest thinkers who ever lived, and he had inherited from his father a superb army and a burning ambition, and when he crossed into Asia with that army he did not stop until he had conquered the entire Persian Empire, the greatest empire the world had ever known, in the space of a few short years. His name was Alexander, and the world has called him Alexander the Great ever since. When he came down into Egypt, the Egyptians did not resist him. They welcomed him gladly as a liberator because he was freeing them from the hated Persians. The Persian governor handed over the country without a fight, and Alexander went up to the ancient capital and made sacrifice to the sacred bull and honoured the Egyptian gods, and the priests, grateful and shrewd, crowned him as Pharaoh, the son of the gods, the lord of the two lands, so that this young Macedonian became, in the eyes of Egypt, simply the newest in the immense line of god-kings that stretched back to the very beginning. He made a famous journey too, deep into the western desert, across the burning sands to a lonely oasis where there stood a celebrated oracle of a great god. And there, in the cool shade of the shrine, the priest greeted him, it was said, as the son of the god. And whatever passed between them Alexander never fully told, but he came out changed, more certain than ever of his own divine destiny. But the thing Alexander did in Egypt that mattered most, the thing that would shape the last and in some ways most brilliant chapter of the whole story, was almost an afterthought. Riding along the flat Mediterranean coast at the western edge of the delta, at a place where a long limestone ridge and a sheltering island made a fine double harbour, he stopped and looked and saw at once what could be built there, and he traced out with his own hand the boundaries of a new city, marking the line of its walls, they say, with barley flour, because no chalk was to be found, so that the birds came down and ate the marks, which his seers declared a sign that the city would feed the whole world. He named it, of course, after himself, Alexandria, and then he marched away east to conquer the rest of the world, and never saw his city rise, and died young, far away in the heart of the old Persian lands, of a fever, with his vast conquests barely a decade old and no grown heir to hold them, and his empire. The moment he was gone, was torn apart among his generals, each seizing what he could. The general who seized Egypt was a shrewd, tough, level-headed man named Ptolemy, one of Alexander's oldest friends and boyhood companions, and he chose the richest and most defensible prize of all, the ancient granary behind its deserts and its river. And he did one more brilliant thing. When Alexander's body was being carried in its golden coffin back toward Macedonia for burial, Ptolemy intercepted the funeral procession, seized the corpse of the conqueror, and brought it to Egypt, and eventually laid it to rest in a magnificent tomb in the heart of Alexandria, so that the mummified body of Alexander the Great became the sacred centerpiece and the source of legitimacy for the new dynasty, a relic pilgrims and kings would come to visit for centuries. Ptolemy made himself pharaoh and founded a line, and every king of that line for the next 300 years was also named Ptolemy, one after another, so that they blur together, while the queens, to distinguish the branches, took a handful of recurring names, so that the dynasty is a great tangle of Ptolemies and Cleopatras and Arsinos and Berenices, marrying one another, often brother to sister in the old Egyptian royal fashion, scheming and murdering and reconciling down the generations. They were Greeks, these Ptolemies, Macedonian Greeks, and they never really became Egyptian the way the Libyans and the Nubians had. They kept to their Greek language and their Greek ways, ruled through a Greek governing class, settled Greek soldiers and merchants throughout the country, and lived apart in their gleaming Greek city on the coast, a little aloof from the ancient land they governed. And yet they were careful and clever rulers who understood exactly what they had. To the Egyptians they presented themselves as proper pharaohs, taking the old titles, worshipping the old gods, and building for them on a scale not seen since the age of empire. In fact, many of the most beautiful and best preserved Egyptian temples that visitors marvel at today, the great temples that seem the very image of pharaonic Egypt, were built not by the ancient pharaohs at all, but by these Greek Ptolemies, faithfully in the old style, right down to the last hieroglyph. So devoutly did they play their role, and in their capital of Alexandria they built something new under the sun, a city that became the greatest and most dazzling in the entire world, the wonder of the age. It grew to hold hundreds of thousands of people, Greeks and Egyptians and Jews and traders from every shore, laid out on a grand plan of wide, straight avenues, one of them said to run for miles, lit and colonnaded, cooled by the sea breeze. Its double harbour was guarded by one of the true wonders of the ancient world, a lighthouse of white stone that rose 400 feet into the air on its island, a tower with a great fire burning at its summit, and a polished mirror behind the flame, its light thrown out across the dark water to guide ships in from many miles at sea. So famous that its very name became the word for lighthouse in more than one later language. And at the heart of the city, the Ptolemies founded something even more precious than the lighthouse, something that would outshine even their gold in the memory of the world. They founded a home for the learned, a house of the goddesses of the arts, which in Greek was called a museum. And beside it they founded a library, and they set out, deliberately and systematically, to gather into that library a copy of every book in the world. It was an astonishing ambition, and they pursued it without limit. Agents of the king went out to the book fairs and markets of the whole Mediterranean world, buying scrolls by the hundred. Every ship that put into the great harbour was searched, not for smuggled goods but for books, and any scroll found aboard was carried up to the library and copied, and often the library kept the original and gave the owner the copy. The king wrote to other kings begging or bullying them to lend their treasured texts for copying. By these means, over the generations, the great library gathered hundreds of thousands of scrolls, very nearly the entire written knowledge of the ancient world, the poems and the plays, the histories and the philosophies, the medicine and the mathematics, and the astronomy and the geography, gathered under one roof beside the sea. And around those scrolls gathered the finest minds of the age, drawn to Alexandria by the king's generous support, given rooms and meals and salaries, and above all the priceless gift of all those books and one another's company, so that for a few golden centuries this one city held the greatest concentration of learning the world had ever seen. Here a scholar measured the size of the whole round earth, simply by comparing the shadow cast by the sun at noon in two distant cities, and got the answer very nearly right, thousands of years before anyone sailed around it to check. Here the geometry that schoolchildren still learn today was gathered and set in order into a single great book of elements that would be studied, unbroken, for more than 2,000 years. Here astronomers charted the stars and the wandering planets, and one bold thinker even suggested that the Earth might go around the sun and not the other way, an idea so far ahead of its time that it was set aside and nearly forgotten for 1,800 years. Here physicians studied the human body as never before, and engineers built machines that opened temple doors by unseen means, and toys that moved by steam. Here the old poems of long-dead bards were carefully edited and preserved, so that much of what survives to us of the earliest and greatest Greek poetry survives, because the patient scholars of Alexandria copied it and corrected it and passed it on. It was one of the high watermarks of the human mind, this quiet library by the sea, and it is one of the great sorrows of history that so much of what it held was lost in the end, burned and scattered across the troubled centuries that followed, so that we possess today only a fraction of the books the world once held, and every so often a scholar still finds. In the sands of Egypt or the binding of some later book, a scrap of something that was thought lost forever, a few lines of a vanished play, a fragment of a forgotten poem, like a single leaf blown to us from that immense lost forest. Rest a moment in the thought of that library. All that patient gathering, all those lamps burning late over the scrolls, all those quiet minds reaching out across the world to save what human beings had learned so that it would not have to be learned again. It is one of the kindest things our species has ever done, and one of the most fragile. But while the scholars gathered their scrolls, the dynasty that fed them was slowly rotting from within. The early Ptolemies had been strong and shrewd, but as the generations wore on they grew soft with luxury and vicious with intrigue. and the family history became a horror of poisonings and murders and civil wars. Brother against sister, mother against son, uncle against nephew, the throne passing back and forth in a welter of blood, while the once great kingdom shrank and weakened. They lost their possessions abroad one by one. They fell deeper and deeper into debt and dependence. And behind all their troubles there loomed, growing ever larger on the horizon, the shadow of a new and irresistible power rising in the west, a city that had begun as a village of shepherds and had grown, in the centuries while all this was happening, into the mightiest state the Mediterranean had ever known, swallowing kingdom after kingdom, until now its long shadow reached across the sea and fell at last upon the ancient land of the Nile. That power, of course, was Rome, and it is here, with Egypt old and rich and weak and beautiful, its dynasty crumbling, its independence hanging by a thread, its scholars still bent over their scrolls, and its priests still chanting the old hymns in temples 3,000 years old, with the shadow of unstoppable Rome falling ever darker across the delta, that there was born into the royal house of the Ptolemies the woman who would become the most famous of all the daughters of the Nile, the last pharaoh, the last independent ruler that ancient Egypt would ever have. Her name was Cleopatra. She was the 7th royal woman of her family to bear that name, and she was, by every account that survives, extraordinary. The old stories dwell on her beauty, but those who actually knew of her stressed something else: her mind, her wit, her voice, which one ancient writer said was like an instrument of many strings, and her gift for languages. She was the only ruler of her entire Greek dynasty in 300 years who ever bothered to learn the Egyptian language of the people she ruled, and she is said to have spoken not only that, but half a dozen other tongues besides, so that she could receive ambassadors from many nations and answer each in his own speech without an interpreter. She was learned, steeped in the science and philosophy of the great library of her city, and she was above all a supremely intelligent and determined politician, thrown while still very young into the most dangerous game on earth, the game of keeping a rich, weak kingdom alive in the shadow of Rome. Her father died and left the throne, in the custom of the family, to Cleopatra and her younger brother jointly, the two of them to marry and rule together in the old fashion, though she was a clever grown woman and he was only a boy in the hands of ambitious court advisers. It was never going to be a peaceful arrangement. The boy's advisers, jealous of her strength and her will, pushed her aside and drove her out of the capital, and she fled to the eastern desert and began, quietly, to raise an army of her own to fight her way back. And at exactly that moment, into this local family quarrel, there came striding the greatest man in the world. For Rome itself was in the throes of a terrible civil war, two of its mightiest generals locked in a struggle for mastery of the whole Roman world, and the loser of the decisive battle had fled east and come, of all places, to Egypt, hoping for shelter and money from the kingdom his family had long protected. He was one of the most famous Romans who had ever lived, and when he arrived off the coast, the boy king's cynical advisers, calculating that it was safer to please the winning side, had him murdered as he stepped ashore, and cut off his head, and presented it to the victor when he arrived a few days later, expecting thanks. The victor was Julius Caesar, and he was not pleased. He was disgusted by the treachery, and he wept, they say, at the ugly death of a man who had once been his son-in-law and his friend before he became his enemy. And Caesar, being Caesar, did not simply take his reward and leave. He installed himself in the royal palace in Alexandria with only a small force of soldiers, and announced that he, as the representative of Rome, would settle the quarrel between the young king and his exiled sister, and summoned them both before him. Now Cleopatra was in exile outside the city, cut off by her brother's troops, and she knew that if she tried to come openly to Caesar, she would be intercepted and killed before she ever reached him. So she did one of the boldest and most famous things in all of history. She had herself smuggled into the palace, at night, past all her brother's guards. The old story, the one everyone loves, says she was wrapped up and carried inside a rolled bundle of bedding or a sack for carrying linens, slung over the shoulder of one loyal servant who walked her straight through the enemy lines and into the presence of the master of the Roman world. And there, in the lamplit room, the bundle was set down and untied, and out of it rose the young Queen of Egypt, dusty and dishevelled and utterly composed, to introduce herself to Julius Caesar. It is one of those moments that sounds too perfect to be true, and perhaps it grew in the telling, but something like it happened, and it worked. Caesar was captivated by her daring, by her wit, by her voice, by the whole astonishing performance of it. He was a man past 50, the most powerful person alive, and she was a young queen of barely 21, with nothing but her mind and her nerve, and by the next morning she had won him utterly to her side. He declared for her against her brother. The city rose in fury, the boy king's troops and the mob of Alexandria besieging Caesar and Cleopatra together in the palace quarter, and there followed a hard and dangerous winter of street fighting, fire and confusion, during which, by tragic accident, fire spread from the harbour where Caesar had burned the enemy fleet, and it is likely that in that blaze a great store of scrolls near the docks was lost, one of the wounds from which the great library would eventually, over the following centuries, bleed away. But Caesar was the finest soldier of the age, and when reinforcements at last came marching to his aid, he broke the siege and crushed the boy king's army, and the young king himself. Fleeing across the river, drowned in his heavy golden armour, and Cleopatra was left, at last the undisputed queen of Egypt, with the master of the Roman world at her side, and, before long, a son in her arms whom she named for him and swore was his. For a while the sun shone on Cleopatra. She sailed up the river with Caesar on a great pleasure barge, showing the Roman the wonders of her ancient land, the temples and the monuments already unthinkably old, and she went to Rome itself, and lived in Caesar's villa across the river, and watched him rise to become dictator, master of the whole Roman world in all but name. But it did not last. For Caesar had gathered too much power for the proud old men of Rome to bear, and on a spring day they surrounded him in the Senate house and struck him down with their daggers, and the greatest man in the world lay dead on the marble floor, and Cleopatra, suddenly without her protector and unwelcome now in a Rome plunged back into chaos, gathered up her small son and sailed home to Egypt to wait and watch and see which way the world would break. It broke, after more years of civil war, into two great camps. Caesar's heir, his young grandnephew whom he had adopted as a son, a cold, careful, brilliant young man, took the west of the Roman world. And Caesar's right-hand man, his best general, a big, generous, hard-drinking, warm-hearted soldier beloved by his troops, took the east. This general's name was Mark Antony, and because the east was his to govern, and because he needed the wealth of Egypt for the great war he dreamed of waging against the old enemy in the further east, he summoned the Queen of Egypt to come and meet him and explain herself, for there were questions about whose side she had taken in the recent wars. And Cleopatra, who understood men and power and spectacle as few people ever have, answered that summons with one of the grandest entrances ever staged. She came to him sailing up a river to the eastern city where he waited, and she came in a barge with a gilded stern and purple sails and silver oars that beat time to the music of flutes and pipes and harps. And she herself lay beneath a canopy of cloth of gold, dressed as the goddess of love, while beautiful boys like painted cupids fanned her, and lovely girls dressed as sea nymphs handled the ropes, and the wonderful smell of burning incense drifted from the ship all the way to the crowded banks, so that the whole city poured out to see her, and Antony was left sitting alone in the marketplace, while the multitudes ran to the river. And the word went around that the goddess of love had come to feast with the god of wine for the good of all the East. It worked, as it was designed to work. Antony was a simpler and warmer man than Caesar had been, and he was overwhelmed, and he followed her back to Alexandria, and there he spent a long, golden, careless season as her guest. And the two of them, both people of enormous appetite and charm and humour, formed a society of pleasure they laughingly called the Company of the Inimitable Livers, and they feasted and gamed and drank and roamed the city in disguise at night playing pranks. two of the most powerful people in the world behaving, for one shining winter, like happy children. But Antony was not a free man. He was one of the masters of Rome, bound by duty and by a political marriage to the sister of his cold young rival in the west, and eventually the world called him away, and he left Cleopatra, who bore him twins, a boy and a girl, and did not see him again for years. Yet the bond held. In time, as his alliance with his rival in the west soured toward open enmity, Antony came back to the east, and back to Egypt, and back to Cleopatra, and this time he came to stay. He married her, in the eyes of the East if not in the law of Rome, and he lived with her in Alexandria, and he leaned more and more upon the wealth and the ships and the grain of Egypt for his wars and his ambitions. And in a great ceremony in the heart of the city, seated on golden thrones on a silver platform before the assembled people, Antony and Cleopatra staged what came to be called the Donations of Alexandria, in which Antony, a Roman general giving away Roman-conquered lands, granted to Cleopatra and to their children a great swath of the eastern kingdoms, proclaiming her a queen of kings, and her son by Caesar the true king of kings and the rightful heir of the murdered dictator. It was a magnificent gesture, and it was, for Antony, a fatal one, because back in Rome his cold and patient rival had been waiting for exactly this, and he took the news of the donations and used it, brilliantly and ruthlessly, to turn the whole Roman world against Antony, painting him as a great Roman soldier bewitched and unmanned by a foreign eastern queen, a traitor who meant to give away the empire's lands to her children and move the centre of the world from Rome to Alexandria. It was propaganda, unfair and one-sided, but it was devastatingly effective, and it gave the rival the thing he most needed, a war that looked not like one more grubby Roman civil war among ambitious generals, but like a righteous crusade of Rome and the West against a foreign queen and the decadent East. And so the last war of the Roman Republic, which was also, though no one quite knew it, the last war for the independence of ancient Egypt, was declared not against Antony the Roman, but against Cleopatra, the Queen of the Nile. The two sides gathered their fleets and their armies and their allies from all around the Mediterranean, and they met at last off the western coast of Greece in the waters of a great gulf, where Antony and Cleopatra's fleet lay bottled up and blockaded through a long, hard summer, sickness and desertion thinning their crews, while the enemy's ships, smaller and faster and superbly handled by a brilliant admiral, waited outside. On the day of the great sea battle, the two fleets came out and faced one another on the calm blue water, hundreds of ships on either side, Antony's great heavy galleys against the light, nimble ships of his rival. And the battle was fierce and confused, and, in the end, indecisive in the way that mattered least, and decisive in the way that mattered most. For at the height of it Cleopatra's squadron, held in reserve behind the fighting line, suddenly hoisted sail and broke away, and fled south for Egypt, and Antony, seeing her go, abandoned his own struggling fleet and his own men, and raced after her in a fast ship. And the two of them escaped together while the fleet and the army they left behind, leaderless and betrayed, in time surrendered. Why she fled, whether by a prearranged plan to save the treasure and the ships for a fight another day, or in sudden panic, or because the battle was already lost, no one can now say for certain. But the effect was ruin. Antony never recovered his spirit after that day. The lands and the armies of the East, seeing which way fortune had turned, went over one by one to the winning side, and within a year the victor came east at the head of his legions, unstoppable now, marching down through the old lands toward Egypt, toward Alexandria, toward the end. Antony fought one last brave little skirmish outside the walls of the city, and won it. A final flicker of the great soldier he had been, and came back flushed with the old fire. But it was the last light before dark. The next day his remaining fleet and cavalry went over to the enemy without a blow, and Antony, betrayed and abandoned and believing a false report that Cleopatra was already dead, fell upon his own sword, in the old Roman way, and died in Cleopatra's arms, drawn up with ropes into the fortified tomb where she had shut herself away with her treasure. and now Cleopatra was alone, the last piece left standing on the board. A queen of a conquered kingdom facing a conqueror who held the whole world in his hand. He wanted her alive. He wanted, more than anything, to carry her back to Rome and lead her in chains through the streets in his great triumph. The foreign queen humbled at last, the living proof of his victory, for the crowds to gape at. And Cleopatra, who had been a queen since she was a girl, who had matched wits with Caesar and won the heart of Antony, who was descended from the companions of Alexander and had ruled the oldest kingdom on earth, would not be led through the streets of Rome. She met the conqueror once, in her chambers, and took his measure, and understood, cool and clear-eyed as ever, that there was nothing left for her but that final humiliation, and she resolved, with all the pride of 300 years of pharaohs, to deny it to him. She asked leave to make offerings at Antony's tomb, and she went and knelt there and poured out her grief over the ashes of the great generous soldier she had loved, and she came back and she bathed, and she dressed herself in her finest royal robes, the full regalia of a queen of Egypt, and she arranged herself upon a golden couch. And then, the story says, a countryman came to the guarded door carrying a basket of figs, and the guards looked inside and saw only the ripe fruit and waved him through, and among the figs, or so the tale runs, hidden in the cool leaves, was coiled a small serpent, the sacred cobra of Egypt, the very serpent that reared upon the brow of every pharaoh's crown as the protector of kings, the emblem of divine royalty. And Cleopatra, last of the pharaohs, took the serpent of her ancestors to her, and let it strike, and lay back upon her golden couch, and closed her eyes, and died as a queen, in her own way, at her own hour, uncaptured and unbowed. When the conqueror's men broke in, they found her already gone, laid out in state in her royal robes and her golden crown, with her 2 faithful serving women dying at her feet, one of them still weakly straightening the diadem upon her mistress's head. And when a Roman burst in and cried out in anger, asking whether this was well done, the dying woman answered, with the last of her strength, that it was well done indeed, and fitting for the descendant of so many kings. And with that answer, spoken over the body of the last pharaoh, the ancient independence of Egypt came to its end. And yet, gently now, do not think that Egypt itself ended on that day, in that room, with that queen. A dynasty ended. An independence ended. The long line of pharaohs, Egyptian and Libyan and Nubian and Persian and Greek, that had begun 25 centuries before, with a king out of the south and a double crown, that line came to its close. But the land went on, and the people went on, and the river went on rising and falling exactly as it always had, indifferent to whose face was carved above the temple door. The conqueror who took Egypt did not fold it into his empire like any other province. He kept it for himself, as a personal possession, precisely because it was so precious, the richest granary in the whole Roman world, the land whose grain would feed the vast hungry city that now ruled the Mediterranean. Great fleets of ships sailed every year from Alexandria laden with Egyptian wheat, and Rome came to depend upon that grain for its very bread, so that Egypt, in the end, fed the empire that had swallowed it, went on giving of its endless fertility to strangers, just as it had given to the pharaohs, and to the Persians, and to the Ptolemies before them. The river did not care. The black soil did not care. It went on making grain. And the old ways did not vanish overnight either. For centuries after the last queen, the ancient temples still stood and still functioned, the priests still chanted the old hymns, the incense still rose, the sacred animals were still honoured, and the Roman emperors, far away in their marble city, still had themselves carved on the temple walls of Egypt in the guise of pharaohs, in the old poses, in the old dress. Making offerings to the old gods, the last faint continuation of a tradition already 3,000 years old, so that if you visit certain temples today, you can see a Roman emperor who never set foot in Egypt depicted as a bare-chested pharaoh, presenting bread and wine to the gods of the Nile, the very last frames of the longest story in the world. But the old religion was dying, slowly, as a great tree dies, from the top down, over generations, its outer branches going bare while the trunk still stands. New faiths were spreading through the empire, and one of them in particular, born in a land not far to the east, took deep and lasting root in Egypt, so that in time the great majority of Egyptians turned away from the gods their ancestors had worshipped for thousands of years, and embraced the new belief, and the old temples were closed at last by imperial order, their priesthoods dissolved, their revenues cut off, their doors shut, their sacred images left to the dust and the silence. And with the priests went the knowledge of the sacred writing, for the hieroglyphs had always been the special learning of the temple scribes, handed down master to pupil in an unbroken chain reaching back to the very dawn of Egypt, and when that chain was finally broken. When the last old priest who could read the words of the gods died without a pupil to teach, the knowledge died with him. The temple walls all over Egypt still stood covered from floor to ceiling in their beautiful carved pictures. The owls and the feet and the coiled ropes and the seated gods, the names of kings dead 3,000 years, the spells to guide the soul through the night. All of it still there, sharp and clear in the stone, and no living person on earth could read a single word of it. For nearly 1,500 years the great library of Egyptian writing lay open to the sky and closed to the mind, a whole civilization's memory locked behind a script that had become mere decoration, beautiful and utterly silent. Travellers came and stared at the pyramids and the temples and the strange carved birds, and made up wild guesses about what they might mean. But the true voice of ancient Egypt had fallen quiet, and it seemed that it would stay quiet forever. That it did not stay quiet forever is one of the loveliest gifts the modern age ever gave to the ancient one. For centuries later, when a foreign army came to Egypt bringing scholars along with its soldiers, some workmen digging near a town in the delta to strengthen an old fort turned up a heavy slab of dark stone, broken at the edges, and on it, carved in 3 different scripts, was a single decree of one of the later Ptolemaic kings, the same words written first in the sacred hieroglyphs, then in a flowing everyday Egyptian hand, and then, at the bottom, in Greek. And Greek could still be read. Here at last was the key, the same message in the lost language and in a known one, side by side. It took many years and the patient genius of more than one brilliant mind, poring over that stone and copies of it, comparing the royal names, matching the signs, testing and failing and testing again, until at last a young scholar, who had loved Egypt since he was a boy and had taught himself a dozen languages in pursuit of it, cracked the code and understood in a rush how the whole marvellous system worked, part picture and part sound, and reeled home to his brother crying that he had done it, and fainted dead away from the shock of it, and lay unconscious for days. And when he woke, the silence of 3,000 years was broken. The owls and the feet and the coiled ropes began to speak again. Slowly at first, then faster and faster, as more and more scholars learned the newfound art, the temple walls of Egypt gave up their secrets, and the names of the kings came back, and the hymns and the spells and the accounts of grain, and the boasts of the conquerors, and the love poems of the tomb workers, and the labour complaints, and the letters home, until the whole immense chorus of the oldest voices in history came flooding back into the world. And we could hear the ancient Egyptians speak to us in their own words at last, across all those silent centuries, telling us their names, asking us, as they always asked, only to be remembered. Let us slow down now and drift a little, and simply think about what these people made and left behind, because the sheer weight of it is a soothing thing to hold in the mind as sleep comes closer. Think first of the depth of time. When we say ancient Egypt, we tend to imagine one thing, one age, one look. The pyramids and the pharaohs all together in a single golden blur. But the truth is far stranger and far grander. Egypt was not a moment. It was a river of time so long that it dwarfs almost everything that came after. Consider that the Queen Cleopatra, whom we have just watched die, lived closer in time to us, closer to the age of automobiles and telephones, than she lived to the building of the Great Pyramid. Let that settle slowly. The pyramid was already so ancient in her day, already more than 2,500 years old when she was born, that it was to her very nearly as ancient as she is to us. She could have gone as a tourist to marvel at a monument older to her than she is to our own great-grandparents. The Sphinx, when the first pharaohs of the New Kingdom rode past it in their chariots, was already so old and so long half-buried that one young prince, napping in its shadow after a hunt, dreamed that the great stone lion spoke to him and promised him the throne if he would only clear the sand from its shoulders, and he did, and he became pharaoh, and he set up a stone between its paws to tell the story, and that stone is still there, telling it. Egypt was old even to itself. Its people lived among monuments already unthinkably ancient, walked past statues carved 1,000 years before their grandfathers, worshipped in temples founded before memory, and that long, deep, reassuring sense of continuity, of belonging to something vastly older than oneself, was woven into the Egyptian soul. They believed the world had a proper order that had been set at the beginning and would go on to the end, and their whole art and religion was a way of aligning themselves with that order, of taking their small place in a pattern far larger and far more lasting than any single life. There is deep rest in that idea, the sense of being one small quiet thread in an immense and patient weaving. And think of the practical marvels these patient people worked out, one careful step at a time. They watched the sky so closely, year after year, that they noticed a certain bright star rose just before the sun at the same time each year, right when the flood was due. And they built a calendar upon it, a calendar of 3 seasons and 12 months and 365 days, so good and so simple that a version of it, passed down through the ages, underlies the calendar hanging on your wall tonight. They worked out a practical geometry to measure their fields after each flood erased the boundary markers, so that each farmer got back exactly his own portion of the black soil, and from that humble need to fairly divide the mud grew much of the mathematics that later ages would build upon. They studied the human body with real care, and wrote medical texts that describe wounds and treatments, and even the workings of the heart and the pulse, with a calm, observant, practical intelligence, setting broken bones and stitching cuts and easing pain with honey and willow and quiet skill. They quarried and moved and raised stones of a size that would challenge our own machines, and they did it with ramps and sledges and levers and rope and the patient muscle of thousands of well-fed, well-organized men, and above all with a mastery of organization, of feeding and housing and directing a vast workforce toward a single goal over many years that is in its own way as impressive as any pyramid. And they made beauty. Everywhere, endlessly, they made beauty. Not only the giant monuments, but the small things. The perfect painted bird on a tomb wall, the graceful curve of an alabaster jar, the tender carving of a husband and wife seated side by side with an arm around each other for eternity, the delicate glass and faience gleaming blue-green like the river, the jewellery of gold and turquoise and deep blue lapis, the cosmetic spoons carved as swimming girls, the little wooden servants and boats and houses placed in the tombs so the dead would want for nothing. And through all of it, from the greatest temple to the smallest amulet, runs the same calm, ordered, confident, gentle spirit, a civilization utterly at peace with itself, sure of its place in the world and its place in eternity, unhurried, patient, kind to its own, in love with life and quietly certain that life would go on past the grave. Come back with me once more to the river, because that is where we began and that is the truest place to end. Set aside the kings now, all of them, the pyramid builders and the conquerors and the queens. Let them sleep in their painted tombs, and think only of the river and the people who lived beside it, generation after generation, for thousands upon thousands of years. Picture an ordinary evening on the Nile, an evening that could belong to almost any moment in that vast span, for the essential shape of it barely changed from the first farmers to the last queen. The sun is going down, huge and red, sinking into the western desert where the dead were laid, and the whole valley turns to gold and then to rose, and then to deep blue. The heat of the day loosens its grip. Along the water the palm trees stand black against the fading light. A farmer walks home along the top of a dike between the flooded fields, his tools over his shoulder, his shadow long behind him, and the water on either side of him holds the pink of the sky, still and shining, broken now and then by the ring of a rising fish. Cattle move slowly toward the byre, and a boy walks behind them with a switch, singing to himself. In the reeds the birds are settling, a great soft rustling and murmuring as thousands of them come in to roost, and a heron stands motionless in the shallows, one leg lifted, patient as the country itself. Smoke rises straight up from the cooking fires of the village, and the smell of baking bread drifts out over the water. A woman grinds the last of the day's grain in the doorway of her house, and children chase one another between the mud-brick walls, and somewhere a lute is being played, a few soft notes over and over, going nowhere in particular. And overhead, one by one, the enormous stars come out, the same stars the Egyptians watched so closely, the imperishable ones that circle the north and never set, where they believed the souls of the blessed dead went to live forever, and the great band of the sky that they saw as a heavenly river, a Nile in the sky, mirroring the Nile on the earth, so that above and below. The water flowed on forever. This was the world they knew, and this was the world they hoped never to leave, not even in death. For when an Egyptian imagined paradise, he did not imagine golden streets or endless rest. He imagined this. He imagined the field of reeds, a place exactly like the Egypt he loved, only perfect, a green country of fields and canals and palm groves under a kind sun, where the flood always came at its proper time, and the grain always stood tall, and the fish were always plentiful, and the birds always thick in the marshes, where a man could plough his own good land and harvest his own good grain, and sit in the evening by his own front door, with the wife he loved and the children he had raised, at peace forever, in a river valley that never failed. That was their whole hope, and it is such a simple and such a human one that it can bring a lump to the throat across all the centuries. Not to escape the world, but to keep it. Not to leave the ones they loved, but to stay with them. To go on, quietly, doing the ordinary and beautiful things that a life beside a gentle river allows, morning after morning, forever. They built the pyramids and wrote the spells and dried the bodies and painted the tombs, all for the sake of that one modest dream, to wake, after the long night of death, into a bright morning in a land like home, and find everything they had loved still there, still theirs, waiting, and in a way we cannot quite explain, that dream has half come true, for they are remembered. The thing they feared most was to be forgotten, to have their names erased, and instead their names are spoken today in every land on earth, by children in classrooms and travellers in museums, and by you, tonight, drifting towards sleep. The tomb worker who went on strike for his late rations, the queen who came wrapped in a carpet, the boy king in his golden mask, the great old Ramesses with his hooked nose, the wise Imhotep who first taught stone to climb toward the sky, they are none of them forgotten. Their faces are looked upon with wonder, their words are read aloud, their monuments are visited by millions. The one thing they asked of the future, that it remember them, the future has granted, more fully and more lovingly than they could ever have imagined. And so, in their own quiet way, they got their wish. They live on. Not in the field of reeds, perhaps, but in something almost as good, in the long memory of the whole human family, in the wonder of every person who has ever stood in the shadow of the pyramids and felt the weight of all that time, and been, for a moment, part of their immense and patient story. There is time yet, before we let the fire go out, to wander a little more slowly through one or two corners of this world we have been passing through, for a great civilization is not only its kings and its wars, but its small daily wonders, and those are the gentlest things of all to think about as sleep draws near. Think of the festivals, for the Egyptian year was full of them, bright interruptions in the long patient round of flood and growth and harvest. There were days when the statue of a god, which normally rested hidden in the dark heart of its temple, where only the priests might go, was lifted onto a golden ceremonial boat and carried out on the shoulders of the priests through the crowds. Veiled in a shrine but present, so that ordinary people who could never enter the sanctuary could feel their god pass by among them. There were great river processions when a god sailed upstream to visit another god in another city, the sacred barge towed by boats full of singers and musicians, the banks lined with cheering crowds, the whole valley given over to celebration, to feasting and drinking and dancing and the setting aside of ordinary cares. There was a festival of the dead, a gentle one, when families would cross the river to the west, to the tombs of their ancestors, and sit among them, and share a meal there in the cool of the tomb chapel, eating and drinking with their beloved dead as if they were still present, telling them the news of the year, keeping them company, so that even death did not entirely break the warm thread of family that ran through Egyptian life. Think of the sacred animals, for the Egyptians saw the divine peering out at them from the eyes of the creatures around them. The cat, sleek and self-possessed, guardian of the granary against mice and of the home against snakes, was so beloved and so honoured that to harm one was a grave crime. And when a household cat died, the family would shave their eyebrows in mourning. There was a great bull, chosen for its special markings, that was believed to be the living vessel of a god, kept in luxury in its own temple, fed the finest food, consulted as an oracle, and when at last it died, embalmed with all the care and expense of a great noble, and buried in a huge stone coffin in a vast underground gallery alongside the mummies of all the sacred bulls that had gone. Before it, a line of them stretching back centuries. There were the sacred birds of the god of wisdom, the long-beaked ibis wading in the shallows, and the falcon of the sky god soaring overhead, and the scarab beetle rolling its ball of dung across the sand, which the Egyptians watched, and, in one of their loveliest leaps of imagination, saw as an image of the sun itself being rolled across the sky each day, and of new life emerging from what seemed dead, so that the humble dung beetle became a beloved symbol of rebirth, and was carved in stone and worn as a charm by rich and poor alike, a little promise of mourning worn against the heart. And think, above all, of the river as a god for the flood itself. That yearly miracle on which every single life depended was honoured as a divine being, a plump and gentle figure bringing the gifts of the water, and when the river began to rise each year the whole country gave thanks, and offerings were cast into the flood, and hymns were sung to the coming of the water that praised it as the maker of all good things, the nourisher of the fields, the friend of the poor, the giver of life to every creature, a hymn of pure gratitude to the river for simply doing once more, faithfully, the thing it had always done. That gratitude is perhaps the deepest note in the whole long music of Egypt, a settled, unhurried thankfulness for the daily gift of an ordinary and sufficient life, for bread and beer and the shade of a sycamore, for the flood that came and the grain that grew and the family gathered in the evening, for the river that never, in the memory of any of them, entirely failed. They were not a restless people, forever reaching for more. They were, at their heart, a contented people, in love with what they had, hoping only to keep it forever. And there is a lesson folded up in that, quiet and warm, for anyone lying awake at the end of a long day, a lesson about being grateful for the ordinary river of one's own life, for the roof and the meal and the ones asleep in the next room, for the plain and enormous gift of another safe night and the certainty of another morning. The Egyptians knew that gift for what it was, and they gave thanks for it, for thousands of years, and it kept them. The fire is very low now, and the story is nearly told, and so let us go back, one last time, to where we began. Because the very end of a tale and its very beginning are always close neighbours. It is night on the Nile, any night. This night, and the river is doing exactly what it has done since before the first farmer scattered the first seed into the black mud, sliding north, wide and dark and patient, carrying the reflections of the stars down toward the sea. The desert on either side has given up the day's heat, and lies cool and silver under the moon. The palm trees stand still. The great monuments the Egyptians raised are all still there in the dark, the pyramids sharp against the stars on their plateau above the sleeping city, the Sphinx below them with the sand drifted once more about its paws, keeping its long patient watch toward the east where the sun will rise, as it has kept it through more sunrises than any mind can hold. The vast temples stand silent along the river, their forests of painted columns black and towering in the moonlight, the carved faces of gods and kings looking out over the water they have watched for 3,000 and 4,000 years. The old tombs sleep in their valley, their painted walls fresh and bright in the sealed dark. The little boats and servants and game boards waiting in the stillness for a morning that, in a sense, has already come, in the wonder of every visitor who steps into that quiet and catches their breath. And down in the fields, in the villages that are still there, that have always been there, life goes on tonight almost exactly as it went on then. A farmer sleeps on his roof under the stars. Cattle stir softly in the dark. The river slides by, faithful, patient, indifferent to the fall of every dynasty, ready to rise again in its season and lay down its gift of black soil, as it did for the pharaohs, as it did for Cleopatra, as it does still. Countless nights have fallen on this river, more than anyone could ever count, and every single one of them, without exception, has been followed by a mourning. The night the first king wore the double crown. The night before the capstone was set on the Great Pyramid. The night the boy king was laid in his golden mask and the door was sealed. The night the great Rameses died an old man with the desert wind at the windows. The night the library's lamps burned late over the scrolls. The night the queen took the serpent to her breast and lay back in her golden robes. The night the last priest who could read the sacred words closed his eyes for the last time, and the writing fell silent. And through all of those nights, the valleys slept, as valleys do, as you should, because sleep is the oldest and gentlest of all the kingdoms, and it never falls. And it asks nothing of you but that you let go and rest. Somewhere out there in the dark tonight the she-cobra of the crown still coils in stone upon the brow of 100 carved kings, and the great stone lion still gazes east, and the imperishable stars still wheel slowly around the north exactly as they did when the Egyptians named them the home of the blessed dead. And they will all still be there in the morning, patient as ever, as they have been through every calamity and every triumph of 5,000 years, which is, when you think about it, all any of us is ever truly asked to do. To wait out the night, warmly breathing slowly, while the river carries the last reflections downstream toward the sea, and to trust that the morning will come, because it will. It always has. Up over the eastern desert it will come, as it came for the farmers and the pharaohs and the queens, a thin line of rose, then gold, then the whole vast sky filling with light, and the first birds calling in the reeds, and the pyramids catching fire at their tips before anything else, and the long shadow of the Sphinx stretching out across the sand toward the reborn sun. There are other worlds to walk through slowly, on other nights, older ones and stranger ones and gentler ones, whole lost civilizations that rose and flourished and faded beneath their own patient stars, and they will keep, the way Egypt kept, waiting quietly for us to come and wander through them together in the dark, unhurried, on some evening yet to come. But that is for another time. For now there is only this river, and this night, and the slow breathing of a land that has seen everything and forgiven all of it, and gone on flowing regardless, and the great monument standing calm in the moonlight, and the long, long story you have been carrying with you towards sleep, folding itself up at last, gently, like fine linen laid away in a chest, like a sail furled at the end of a voyage, like a blanket drawn up warm at the foot of the bed. So let your shoulders grow heavy, and let your breath grow slow, and let the last of the day drift away downstream with the reflections and the reeds. The story will keep. The part you missed will be waiting for you, patient as stone, whenever you wish to come back to it. And the river will go on flowing through your dreams, quiet and dark and endless, all the way to the sea. Good night then from the black land and the red. Good night from the river that has fed the world since before the world was counting. Good night from the pyramids in the starlight, and the lion in the sand, and the queen asleep in her golden robes. Sleep now. The stars are watching, the way they always have. The Sphinx is keeping its patient watch, and the morning, as it always has, will come up gold over the desert, in its own good time.